And it's becoming apparent, even absent the declining budgets that we're facing, not just here in the U.S., but elsewhere in the world, that we're simply going to be unable to respond effectively to these growing number of crises unless we make radical shifts in the way we approach disaster response. And so some of the factors that we're looking at in OFDA, one, as I said, our mandate is to coordinate the federal response. So we need to take more of a whole-of-government approach and bring the various capabilities of the U.S. government more to bear in responses. And we've seen that most recently in Japan, where you've had not only the devastating earthquake and the tsunami, but also the nuclear disaster. We brought in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, that worked under our teams very effectively. And it's providing that platform and coordinating well with those other government institutions that we think is critical. And I'm going to talk in a minute a little bit about Haiti, where there was also a significant whole-of-government response. But there's other things that need to be done. We need to bring new partners into this arena. And certainly we need to bring new donors in, new government donors. And that's happening to a significant degree. We're working closely with a number of partners around the world, trying to better implicate them into the international response architecture. And of course, we need to mitigate the impact of disasters before they happen. That's absolutely key. When we talk about that, it's really a case of building resilience. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute of how we approach that. But as I said, the scale of need is only going to grow. And the effort that we need to bring to this, to really do a better job at dealing with what's coming, is to take a whole-of-society approach. And the private sector, we think, is also going to be absolutely critical to that. And I know there's been a significant interest within the private sector to look at continuity of operations, and there's a lot of effort on that front that I think is really paying off for businesses. And a few companies have taken it a step or two further, and they're looking at not only protecting their own business interests, but they're looking at their markets and extending the types of programming they're getting involved with, the type of efforts they're funding, and looking at protecting markets. And we think that is the way to the future. Frankly, I think it's something that we as a government agency and even the NGO community and other international actors have not done a good enough job in reaching out to the private sector and working with them to bring them in. We're now instituting a program called the Pacific Rim Coordination Center, where we're looking at doing private sector mapping, just like we do with the international aid agencies in response. We go to ReliefWeb or any number of other websites that'll have real-time data of where people, what organizations are working where, the 3 Ws, who, what, and where. But we need that for the private sector as well. We need to bring those linkages in, not only to work on specific programmatic issues in the area of disaster risk reduction, mitigation, and response, but also to help the business sector, who oftentimes want to be helpful in a crisis, but the linkage is, it's difficult. It's difficult to do that in the midst of a disaster. So the more that understanding and connections there can be between the private sector and responders before a disaster hits, the more effective they'll be able to be in a disaster. So I mentioned I'd give you a couple of examples, and I know one of the focuses today is Haiti. And Haiti is certainly an example where mitigation efforts failed miserably. Obviously, we look at the devastation from the earthquake in Haiti, and then just not too long after that, another significant earthquake in Chile, where the results were quite a bit different, demonstrating, of course, the importance of building codes and of preparedness that simply weren't in play in Haiti. Now, it's our responsibility as we respond to this to look at ways we can prevent future disasters, even in the midst of responding to a current one. And I'll just mention one of the many programs that OFDA was engaged in. We were very engaged in Haiti. And it's the Ravine Pintade program that we did. And I went out and reviewed it about 9 months ago. And it was, I thought, a very well thought out program. And its key focus was looking at building with community, working closely with the community. It was taking a neighborhood approach. And it started by doing a risk analysis of what the problems this particular community, which is on a hillside, or the gully, what risk do they face going forward? And clearly there's the risk of earthquake, also hurricanes, and flash flooding. So the project was designed in a way that included extensive retaining walls, and drainage canals. These retaining walls not only help support the structure, provided engineering support structures, but they also help in terms of flood control management. And they also provided wide walkways for evacuation, which was a major problem in Haiti. Simply people weren't able to escape when the earthquake hit. It also took into consideration water and sanitation and hygiene, the way that the program was designed, the community was designed, and it enabled to look at another significant risk factor, which due to poverty in Haiti is disease. And this project, I think, is a very good example of how, in the midst of responding to a terrible disaster, you can take a forward-looking approach and try to reduce the impact of future disasters. And we also, of course, built transitional shelters, and they're very simple, but they do have design qualities in those shelters that are looking at how to better withstand seismic threats.